Boyhood feels like this very narrow, singular channel. And then kind of stepping out of that channel into transness feels like, oh, I have like 1 million channels now. And I think for me, that was super overwhelming.
What was that feeling like once you were well into your process with estrogen? Like, how did that feel in your body?
It feels kind of like coming home.
Welcome to the Masking Tapes. I'm your host, Carolina Hidalgo-McCabe. At the Masking Tapes, we're delving into what does 21st century manhood and masculinity look like? And we're talking to everyday people about how it shows up in their lives and what they're doing about the different crises that we're all facing together. Today, I'm joined by June and Madalena, who are both going to talk about what the queer experience is like, especially as it relates to growing up, experiencing boyhood, and in part experiencing some of manhood, and then understanding their own identities as non-binary and trans feminine. This is a two-part conversation, and so I just invite you in to have an open mind and an open heart. You don't need to understand someone to have compassion for them, and so I just ask that we go into this conversation with compassion and curiosity. So thank you for listening to the Masking Tapes. Today, I am joined by June and Madalena, and we are about to dive into a conversation that is full of learning and questioning and understanding. And we're going to be talking specifically about the queer experience as it intersects with masculinity, manhood, gender, sexuality, etc. So without further ado, I'm so grateful that both of you have decided to come on this episode and this podcast at this time. And I just want to hand the floor over to both of you. So starting with June, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
My name is June. I use they or she pronouns, but sort of the way I think about myself is that I'm somebody who has a very feminine center, and then from that center I kind of move towards more androgyny, masculinity. So yeah, that's sort of how I conceptualize myself.
I'm Madalena. I use she and they pronouns, and I also identify as trans femme.
Wonderful. And can you tell me a little bit more about yourselves outside of your identity as well? Where are you from, and kind of what brought you here onto this podcast right now?
Well, June and I are both from Chicago. We grew up in the Hyde Park area together, actually. So we've known each other since we were 4-ish. And we hadn't quite been friends for 2 decades. And then we saw each other a couple times after we graduated. And there was kind of an interesting kind of energy.
Yeah.
And we just kind of mutually reached out and we're like, we should call and talk specifically about being gay.
Yeah. I like to think that we kind of re-met 2 years ago. And
Yeah.
I remember seeing Madalena and being like, oh, that's somebody that I definitely want to be closer with. And then just deciding to send her a text and be like, we should call. I have a lot of questions about sort of being trans femme. We had a similar coming out timelines maybe, or maybe I think maybe you came out before me, but I was feeling like I didn't really have anyone in my life that I could talk to about being trans femme. So we started calling about that. And then we would speak a lot about our experience, but then we just kind of became really good
We
friends.
just became homies.
That's amazing. And I like the idea of both of you re-meeting yourselves in this other.
Yeah.
What was that experience like?
I think it's been so beautiful. We've known each other since the beginning of our lives, and for a lot of trans people, making sense of that time is really difficult. So when I am trying to describe I don't understand this part of myself, I feel like I used to be this way, June can be like, yeah, you were that way.
Right, yeah. I can corroborate or push back.
Yeah. I think it's a beautiful thing of friendship, just that you can be put in each other's lives, but it's just not quite the right time, and then it is.
Yeah, I think it brought a certain connectedness to my whole life, or continuity maybe, sort of.
Yeah.
Re-meeting you, because we were very different before, but we were still there. And I think that's very important, because I think, or like you were saying, a lot of trans people, at least the way that I used to feel when I was first coming out, is that big part of my sort of early life is kind of like blurry, like not really
Mhm.
connected,
Me
very like
too.
disembodied. But then we're kind of able to go back and be like, oh no, like we were still human beings. Like that's cool.
Mhm.
And so it's just very peaceful, I would say, and grounding and embodying our friendship.
Mm.
Yeah.
For
That's
sure.
beautiful. And speaking of your early years, so usually I start the podcast with the question, what's the hardest thing about being a man? But I after conversing with you both, I'm interested in reshaping this question into what was one of the hardest things about experiencing boyhood or manhood. And I think that it's an important rephrasing, and I'd love for both of you to talk about this, about experiencing boyhood and manhood rather than the identity aligned with it.
I think a lot of times trans people are told that they're supposed to, like, know they're trans from the age of, like, 7. There's, like, a very stereotypical understanding of what it means to be transgender. Just, like, being, like, at 7 years old, being like, "I am a girl in a boy's body." And I don't know if I sort of got that experience. I think something always just felt off, and I didn't know what. And coming into, like, an older age, I had to, like, dispel a lot of those stereotypes about the typical trans feminine path in order to, like, actually accept and understand myself as, like, a girl and as non-binary, and, I feel like a lot of the queer journey is kind of, like, dispelling myths that have been, like, seeded in you from, like, society, and they may not even have been, like, said many times, but somehow you know. That being said, I feel like I don't know if I ever felt like I had interacted with manhood. I think when manhood started to feel around the corner, things started to feel really weird. I was like, "This isn't right, this isn't right." I would love to say that I ducked out before then, but that's not quite how being a man functionally works. I think we all carry a lot of weight, whether we like it or not, as people who are raised as boys and men. And I think honestly that was the hardest part, how I connected with myself, but also like the barriers that I put up for connecting with others. Those two things go hand in hand because I just didn't feel like there was like an avenue for me to be the full human being that
Mhm.
I wanted to be. And I think the same goes for a lot of men um, who aren't trans. Like it's a very isolating experience sometimes, boyhood and manhood.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I feel like what I love about transness and transition is this idea of like transformation where you're able to kind of not just go from one thing to another, but go from one thing and then have all these different kind of paths or ways of being or ways of expressing yourself that kind of open up. Boyhood feels like this very narrow, singular channel. And then kind of stepping out of that channel into transness feels like, oh, I have like 1 million channels now. And I think for me, that was super overwhelming because I was like, which one am I going to choose? Which one is more authentic to myself? Which one is like June? And I think coming from a place where I had sort of been in a channel like with a current carrying me into being like, well, now I have to make the water. Like that's crazy. Um, was really challenging, but helped it sort of necessitated me to begin embodying myself to be like, oh,
Mm.
do I like this? Like, do I like he him
Mhm.
pronouns? Do I like what do I like to wear? Like, what words do I
Mhm.
like? Because I think in boyhood, I was just kind of letting words and clothing and this experiences kind of just surround me and bounce off of me. But but not really feeling like I had the space to really consider how they made me feel because it felt very necessary, kind of like life or death, kind of to be like, I have to conform, I have to do these things, I have to be a part of these spaces. When I sort of decided that I wanted to change my name, which was sort of how I conceptualized the beginning of my transition before I was even like, oh, I'm trans or what label I'm going to use. It was suddenly something that I had to tune into myself and be like, I really like this. And that's a really awesome feeling. And then it's sort of after I was able to identify that feeling of like joy and freedom and kind of wonder, it became a lot easier to make other decisions about things that I liked or didn't like. Because I think for so much of my life, boyhood was felt very confusing because I didn't, I just kind of had this like wash of maybe anxiety, but it wasn't, I didn't have strong opinions about things. I was just kind of like, well, this is my experience. Like, this is what I'm going through. And now, sort of coming into somebody who has, like, realizing that I am somebody who really cares very strongly about so many things. And so I think of Boyhood and Manhood, it's kind of like a really strongly moving channel. So, and so many people, I think, don't realize that, like, you can step out of it, but getting to that point is, like, oftentimes there's a lot of pain for people who wanna step out, I think, and that was the case for me, but really what helped me step out was the joy. Being like, "Oh, wait, like, I can just change my name, and this feels great. What the heck?"
I was telling a friend that I was going to have you both on the podcast, and she sent me this quote that she recently heard, which was, "Gender is not defined by opposites of male or female propping each other up. It's more so cultural palettes of meaning to draw from." And I think the idea that both of you have expressed of it's not this like one size fits all approach. It's a palette that you're trying out names and pronouns and dress and actions and all of these things that that break those bounds of opposites, or that analogy, June, of being able to step out of the river. Even though you've kind of stepped out of the river, do you feel yourself like dipping your toes back in the river sometimes?
Oh, yeah, all the time. I think
Like
it's
when?
I think sometimes I feel it when I'm put in spaces where my body feels like it isn't safe to present as my full self, and sometimes that's correct. Sometimes I'm genuinely in spaces where that's not the vibe, and sometimes it's just my habit. When I was having those experiences, I used to get very upset at myself and be like, I haven't grown at all. Like, I'm still the same. I'm still in Boyhood. I'm still sort of living as this boy, kind of like trying to be something else. And then I realized, like, these feelings, these very uncomfortable, like maybe what we call dysphoria, or, pain, internal pain, they're actually signaling to me something about these spaces that I was in, being like, okay, trust. I grew up really not trusting my feelings or my body. And so then to be like, when an unpleasant feeling comes up or pain comes up, and for me to be like, this is telling me maybe I'm, like, it's okay that I'm having, these uncomfortable feelings, because they're helping me in this situation. They're telling me this situation isn't great. I think I'm really trying to be more compassionate towards myself in that regard, because the I like that part of me, that body, whatever that feeling, it knows very clearly if this is a safe or not a safe situation.
Madeline, I was recently having a conversation with a friend of mine who he's queer, and when I asked him what the hardest thing about being the man was, he said that he felt like growing up he kept playing this game of manhood, thinking that if he played it hard enough, he could win. And he felt like he didn't know that he'd lost it a long time ago. Like he could never win that game. Like he was just like, I was still playing that game not knowing that I was always losing points. Do you relate to that feeling, or what do you think of that, and how did that relate to your experience of identity?
I don't know. I think the way we construct ourselves is very interesting. I mean, the river's always there.
Mm.
I also dip in it too. And I dip in it a lot to be safe. I dip in it sometimes because people put me in it, and I'm just kind of like, okay, if this is where you want me right now, that's fine, but that's you. Sometimes the water does
Yeah.
kind of wash over you.
Can you tell me a little bit about your journey of kind of transition, especially while you're dealing with the assumptions of other people and the waves washing over you at times?
I mean, I remember changing my pronouns in 2020. I had moved to Michigan, and I was in this new space with a lot of queer people living in a co-op in Ann Arbor, and I was like, you know what? Like, fresh start. I'm gonna change my pronouns. And it was kind of in that space that I was very safe. I began to like experiment with my gender a lot, with my presentation. It was like very beautiful space to like kind of begin to get to know yourself. I lived there for a few months. Ended up going back to LA to finish school. And that's kind of when things got gnarly. It was a pretty long year of being very lonely and very isolated in my body. but being out as queer and kind of intimately understanding, kind of this feeling of not being seen, not being treated for who I am, um, like feeling like something that my body didn't and my soul just like did not align with. It's an incredibly visceral experience. And also, I think for my whole life, I had been accustomed to this feeling of sort of like life is just happening, and you're just kind of like behind the glass, like watching it, and like you're just not fully an active participant. And then I was like thinking, I was like, am I trans? Am I just non-binary? I'm in a lot of pain. There's a lot of like self invalidation, like working through those
Mm.
thoughts. I finished school around 2023. And right after I got out, I started estrogen. Um, I had been thinking about doing it for a couple years and was just like invalidating myself. Um, and then I was kind of like, I may as well just try. And if I hate having tits or like if I hate XYZ, I'll go off and you know, I'll get them cut off. I don't care. Like a body is just a fucking body. And like I feel like our soul is what needs nourishment. And it's kind of like we're allowed to make mistakes. And like trans one way, trans the other. I just want to do something that like makes me happy. So I've almost been on estrogen for about a couple years. I feel like significantly far into my transition socially. A lot of spaces where I get she, heard, and missed. There are some spaces where I am he, him.
What was that feeling like once you were well into your process with estrogen? Like, how did that feel in your body? And so I just want to know, in my own humility of not knowing this experience, what it's like.
It feels kind of like coming home.
Mm.
I'm just like, it feels normal. It feels
Mm-hmm.
kind of weird. It
Mm-hmm.
feels right.
Was there anything that surprised you that you were like, oh, I didn't like by coming into your she, her identity and walking through this world with people who don't know you, she, herring you, like, is there anything that has surprised you by the way it impacts the way you walk through this world as like a woman?
Again, like sometimes I do have the benefit sometimes of going undercover in a sense and being like, I'm gonna like go camping for a couple days and I'm just gonna be a boy. Um,
Mm.
and so I kind of have this choice sometimes, like how I want to interact with that, which is a privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like I'm still learning, um, but like body stuff is really crazy.
Mm.
Like
Mm.
dysmorphia is pretty intense. Interacting with people's desire of me is also intense, in a different, in definitely a different sense than it used to be previously. So
Mm-hmm.
it's all very much a clusterfuck. Um,
Yes, I think that's a good way to describe it. June, I first met you because you were running a masculinity group on campus where
Yeah.
there were a lot of men coming together in a room in the campus center talking about masculinity. You're one of my boyfriend's and college housemates, and he was there and he was like, whoa, there's so much overlap between like masculinity and femininity, like, or like men and women. Like your Venn diagram helped like unleash that. I remember first talking about this with you in 2022.
Mhm.
So it's been 3 years and getting to witness your transition as well. So I would love to just hear it from your own words of what that process was like, and especially living in a house with all men around you too during that
Oh,
process.
yeah. Oh my gosh. I decided that I wanted to lead a masculinity workshop because it felt like the most terrifying thing that I could possibly do. And I had just met this wonderful human who felt we had had these beautiful conversations about masculinity, and he was looking for somebody to help him lead these dialogue workshops. And I was like, oh my God, like, yes, like in my head. But then I was also like, oh my God, like I was going to have to like interact with like men to talk about masculinity. And so the idea of talking about something that was very personal to me at that time, sort of, and still is masculinity, and then have to like lead a group of men This was, I think, a year before I came out. So like stuff was bubbling to the surface and I was just like, oh my God, like maybe if I just go over here with Nick, like something will happen. And so we started leading these workshops. And honestly, the workshops were very confusing for me because we were approaching masculinity from like people would talk about their shared experiences and then sometimes we dive into like analytical masculinity, which is like, what is masculinity? Then we draw like a Venn diagram and they were like, wait a second, all these traits about positive masculinity and positive femininity are just like traits of being a good human being. Like, what are we going to do? And so I got so confused, to be honest. So I was in a very analytical headspace when I was leading this masculinity workshop. But I had cues into like people who, I think felt very emotionally and embodied in their masculinity, like my friend, your boyfriend Solomon. He would come in and he'd talk about his experience growing up, sort of being an older brother and how that made him feel and what felt good about sort of being a man and what was difficult. And I remember like watching him and being like really envious of how
Mm,
comfortable he was explaining this manhood and his experience with it and feeling very like I felt a lot of love, and that actually at the time was very difficult. Like I wasn't able to receive that love and feel it. I was kind of like,
mm.
"Oh, like I don't feel that at all." Like I got pissed.
Like envy
I
a
was
little
like,
bit?
"What'd you say?"
Were you envying it a
I
little
was
bit?
really envious, and
Mm,
we I don't think I was able to vocalize it at the time. We discuss the conversations after, but I always remember being like, "Huh, this it feels like this person feels at home right now, and I don't feel at
mm,
home right now." That makes me kind of sad. And so
yeah.
what
And not only that,
yeah.
but you both went on a gap year together to do,
Yes.
like, carpentry and, like, very masculine things, like
Yeah.
working out and, like, building houses and painting stuff rather poorly, but still painting stuff.
Yeah, doing our best.
Like, that's a very intense experience to go from, like, a gap year of that to then, like, coming back to college and being like, "Oof."
Yeah, so I think maybe I can go back and then go forward because I think it's important to know that, like, I think 2 years before I kind of came out and decided I wanted to sort of experiment with what I sort of perceived to be femininity, I was in this space of, like, I really want to embody masculinity, and Solomon is somebody I think when I met him that I was very in awe of sort of this comfortability in his body and embodiment of sort of what I was this is divine masculinity. And so I would never say it like that to him at the time, but I was like, it's honestly just a comfort and like Madeline was saying, like an at home feeling. And so I kind of like in Ithaca kind of deferred to him to sort of be a little bit of a masculine role model. Like I would like we'd work out every day. We'd try to like bulk, quote unquote, God. So in
Yeah.
Ithaca, it felt like he was the person who was kind of, you know, teaching me how to embody myself as a man. But then I would be like, but are you sure you want to do that? Like, are you sure you don't want to cry ever? And then he'd be like, well, and I would just this back and forth of he'd be this steady and I'd just be like da 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 da. Like what about that? What about that? What about that? And it just kind of came to this. It created this beautiful dynamic where we I think really appreciated each other sort of in the ways that we pushed each other. But I
Mm.
think what I didn't do is I wasn't able to express, I think, my actual discomfort in embodying masculinity. I think the
Mhm.
way that I did that was, like, really intensely, like, dissecting it from, like, a theoretical gender
Yeah.
perspective, and he'd be
Yeah.
like, "Damn, like, bro, like, that's a really amazing take," like but then what would I do? I would just continue to be a man. Like, it didn't really change my like, the way that I was feeling inside, and so then when I left Ithaca, and then, after stopping the masculinity workshops, I think that was my sort of descent, positive descent from like, I'm really in my head right now about trying to like figure out all these ways about being a man and what was comfortable into, okay, maybe I don't feel so good. And those feelings were very powerful. And I actually, um, I just honestly, it felt like I had a little bit of this like guiding voice kind of being like, "You need to do something right now." Like, because you're really uncomfortable and in a lot of pain. Um, and I had sort of just like the thing that caused me to sort of have this like crisis of feelings in my body was I like actually misheard this. sort of man say that he used they them pronouns, and I was like, "You can do that? That's crazy, like, but you're a man." And then I was like, "Wait, but
Yeah.
I'm making this assumption." And so
Yeah.
it helped, it stirred up these really intense feelings in me. And I during that year been seeing these sort of people who I later realized were trans feminine, kind of walking around and being like, "I am obsessed with you. Like, I need
Mm.
you or to be you." It was very
Mm.
confusing. I was like,
Yeah.
I was kind of having a crisis of my sexuality and a crisis of like my gender. And I
Yeah.
suddenly was like, what if I kind of, instead of being very fearful of those emotions, what if I like really leaned in? And I luckily had like really supportive friends, like, and they were so nonchalant that I was like, wait a second. I can
Yeah.
do this. Like, this is a safe space. It felt like I just suddenly had all these things that I wanted to try.
Mm.
I wanted, try this new name, try new pronouns, try dressing differently, try
Yeah.
moving my body differently,
Mhm.
try speaking in a different way. There were all of these things that I think started to flow out before I was able to be like, I'm non-binary or I'm trans feminine.
Mhm.
I feel very, I think, grateful that I felt these very intense grounding feelings and desires to be like, yes, I found the name June and I was like, yes.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
to have
Like, it felt
those,
like home,
it felt like
kind of.
home. And I think to have that home base creates, in that home base is in yourself, creates a lot of self-trust. And then you're able to
Mhm.
make more decisions in your life and feel good about them. And be like,
Yeah.
this is not being corroborated by something on the outside. This is my body being like, hello,
Mhm.
hey,
Mhm.
yes. And kind of relying on that feeling to guide my decision making has been really important,
Yeah.
because there's so much discourse, often contradictory, confusing, sort of like label-based discourse about like how to be trans feminine, how to be non-binary, how to be queer. And a lot of that is super helpful. Like, in order
Mhm.
to, I think, get to a comfortable place of letting go, and kind of, you do have to really amass these kind of labels and kind of
Yeah.
ways of being, so then you can be like, I'm gonna let them go, and just being like, you need to make these changes in your life, and let's just
Yeah.
do it, and we'll worry about what they're called later.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. And I think thank you for sharing that. And June, in all honesty, I remember when I first heard that you were coming out as non-binary, I thought I'd found, like, a guy who was doing the work that like, around masculinity. I was like, "Oh my god," like, there's a like, I was, like, l searching for hope for, like,
uh
some guy who was willing to have these conversations, and I remember
Yeah.
selfishly being like, "Oh my god, I thought I had my, like, compatriot of, like, a guy that was doing it," I think I naively framed it as a, like, loss instead of a
Mhm.
gain of, like, "Oh,
Yeah.
wow, like, this is a whole different experience that I need to take a step back and, like, unlearn things, relearn things." And I think sometimes being completely vulnerable here, I remember watching Barbie, and my sister called me afterwards and was like, "Oh my god, like, it's awesome that there's a non-binary character in Barbie." And I was like, "Oh, who's the non-binary character?" And she was like, "Alan." And I was like, "Since when did Alan come out as non-binary in Barbie?" And she's like, "Well, he wasn't like the Kens, like, so he was non so it was they were non-binary." And I was like, just because it's a nice guy doesn't mean that they're non-binary. Like, I don't want, like,
Yeah.
nice men to be like, "Oh, then I'm not a man." Then I like, it clear and then men to be like, "If I'm nice, then I'm not a man," kind of
Mm,
thing. And so that's been a struggle in my mind of, like, how do we navigate like nice men being comfortable enough to still retain their manhood and also the ability to celebrate the spectrum of gender that exists and be able to understand, like, hearing you talk about this feeling of like becoming June and stepping back into like the homeness of your body and listening to yourself is so beautiful. And so I think, like, I had so many biases, and I think a lot of
mhm,
people who listen to this podcast have a lot of biases that they feel afraid to express or ask questions about because of the fierceness of cancel culture sometimes. And so it is this, like,
mm.
in this moment we're in, we don't need to build smaller tents. We need to figure out how to like connect with each other deeper and seek to understand each other not out of judgment but of curiosity. So I'd love to hear any thoughts you have on that.
There is, I mean, I had the very similar monologue in my head too about being like retaining manhood, or kind of like, um feeling like I was sort of stepping out of this circle of masculinity. Oh, like that, there's like a nice boy and now boy no longer. I think it's very interesting how unexpansive masculinity is. And it's like, I am somebody who has still had the experience, like the true experience of boyhood and honestly manhood, I would say for myself. And yet, sort of when I am deciding to sort of reorient my channel of like how I want to express myself and feel, I think that
Mm.
I've conceptualized it more, less of a departure, more as like this is an expansion because, like, don't get me wrong, I can embody masculinity. I know exactly
Mhm.
what it's like. I am not
Mhm.
less of my, like, not oh, I was about to say I'm not less of a man. That's not the language I mean. What I mean is that because I'm somebody who uses a different label to describe my experience doesn't mean I'm somebody who cannot, if I choose, embody that energy. The way that I conceptualize my transness is less right now, less label based, and it is much more about this idea of transition. It's sort of like this
Mhm.
constant state of transformation that I do not think is limited to trans people. I just think that
Mm.
trans people stare that shit in the face and are like, I need to do this.
Mhm.
But I do think that there is this element of manhood that sort of is like it's societally constructed manhood that is like you cannot transition. You cannot access this sort of multifold way of being. Whereas like you can. Like I know so many
Yeah.
men who are like so dynamic and expressive and loving and caring and kind of have these
Mhm.
things that are typically anti-masculine, but they are men. And I think that creating a healthy, sustainable masculinity, I think is about expanding it in that way that I think that trans people kind of are forced to.
Yes.
So, but it is so tempting to allow like the ways that we talk about people and categorically divide them limit the learning we can do from their experience. Being like, I can literally do this. Like, you can be a man and wear what you want. You can wear makeup. It's just like we want to create. I think like I really want to bring. I want to bring just for all the Republicans. I want to bring transition to manhood, and that's not a scary thing. What I mean is like I just want to
Yeah.
be able to make it so men can do the things that feel good. And I
Yeah.
think that creating an expansive space, I think, is super important.
Yeah, and I love the way you said that, in that like your transition is not taking away the opportunity for men to expand their minds when it comes to what is manhood or what is masculinity. You're helping with that expansion of
Mm,
what can be masculine, feminine, etc. And I think like even it's this idea of soft essentialism is the idea that women and girls have more recently in the past 20, 30, 40 years have been able to grow into more of what they want to wear, what they want to do, what they want to be, etc. Whereas that kind of expansion has not happened in the same way for men. And so, for example, I can wear like I think maybe I'm the most masculine dressed in this frame right now. I like to wear pants. I like to wear a little bit more like office chic kind of vibes. And no one's saying like, "Oh, she's not a woman because she's wearing that." Meanwhile, if people wear or if men wear skirts or if they paint their nails or etc., grow their hair out in a certain way, an MMA fighter can paint his nails and people will be like, "Ooh, is he a man?" though. And I think what you're saying here is like trans folks and queer people are helping expand that, not necessarily being like, oh, you have to if you're doing that then you are gay or then you are trans. Instead being like, oh yeah, you can do that and be a man, you could do that and be a woman, you could do that and be trans femme, trans masc, whatever it may be. Thank you so much for listening to this part one of my conversation with June and Madeline. I learned so much from the two of them in this part of the episode, but I really just am so excited to continue to dive into our conversations about queerness and masculinity, boyhood, and trans identity in part two of this conversation. So I will see you all soon.